Good morning. My name is Kurt Brinkus, and I'm the founder and CEO of Indigenous Pact. And today we're going to have another expert live stream today with Bart Garber, who's our head of business development here at Indigenous Pact. Bart is a businessman and a Indian law attorney who's been focused on Alaska Native and Indian country community development. His goal has been to help tribal organizations, businesses, and Indigenous entrepreneurs make the most of their resources and capabilities. And he's been focused on helping communities grow by leveraging special tribal rights and authority to expand those services, revenue, employment, and management opportunities. So with that, I will hand it over to Bart, who's going to be talking about the CARES Act, and the tribe's ability to leverage this policy in a national emergency. So there you go, Bart.
Thanks, Kurt. Yes, I've been involved with federal Indian policy, tribal politics, and development for 30 years. You can see here the screen. And I was a professor, head of Native Studies and political science for 4 years up at University of Alaska, and also a teaching assistant in law school and undergraduate in law and economics. And just to protect myself, this is an educational thing, so I'm not violating a copyright of this real nice poster. I'd appreciate if you'd look at their website at the bottom and buy something from them. But this was the best thing, modern connection visual that I could put in place for this national emergency. What Kurt asked me to do was to discuss how tribes and how people who deal with tribes navigate a very complex legal and administrative system that tribes wander around and live in. The national emergency and the proclamation that the president issued here recently gives an example of how tribes are going to be brought into a national management system and national regulatory system. As you'll see by the end of these 12 slides, it's complicated. For tribes, you've got a history to deal with. You've got a real change in the way that policy has been carried out over time. And then you do have day-to-day, how does a tribe deal with the things around them? You'll find out that tribes are connected to the federal government, the state government, and the communities around them in a multitude of ways. And the federal government still asserts, for the most part, its exclusive authority to deal with tribes, although that, in the last 50 years in particular, has been evolving. At one time, because the federal government just wanted to offload the problem during a termination era, and more recently in a tribal self-governance period where the tribes, because of their advancing knowledge, economics, and political power and savviness, have been taking the reins and have been initiating the policy and the actions instead of simply reacting to them. All that being said, however, I did leave one slide out here. I'll take a poll. Has anybody ever been to a water park? Yes, your turn.
Every other month with the kids.
Okay. Is your water park big enough to have one of those giant swirly rides?
I think so.
Yeah. You climb this huge set of stairways. There's this giant funnel, and you jump into it, and it's like jumping into a toilet bowl, and you twirl around and you come out the bottom. That would be the perfect metaphor for tribal Indian policy. and regulations. Basically, up at the top, there are about a dozen different lines for people to get in line. There's various U.S. agencies and their representative tribal councils and committees. There's tribes and all the various organizations they've put together. And actually, many of these organizations that both of them have put together, but in particular the tribes, have kind of morphed into their own interests, such as the Native American Contracting Association, which is a very strong body of government contracting tribes, and the National Indian Gaming Association, which is a large association of tribal casinos that obviously have their own interests and their own powers. And basically all of them at the top of this swirly ride jump in, and what comes out at the bottom is tribal law and legislation and regulation. You'll see from the slides that follow, this isn't how it always had been. In the past, the federal government decided what would happen and simply dictated it. It now changes. So with that little introduction, Kurt asked me to develop a presentation that might be useful to tribes. I do believe that there are elements of this that would be for some of those tribes and some of those councils that might be less oriented to this issue. But in the vast majority of situations, the tribes and their tribal organizations that they belong to or that they represent tribes on with the government are going to be much, much more sophisticated and expert at this than we are. Our task is to be able to identify elements of that huge pie that what we might be helpful with. So today's purpose was an audience is the We Care Daily Clinic staff, Indigenous PAC staff, and management. And what's the content of this thing? It's going to be the dynamics of tribal relationships and authority in a national emergency as a specific example, and the CARES Act and policy that evolves around it. Policy, the first and foremost, is the proclamation that the president signed earlier last month. The objective here is to introduce the We Care Daily clinics and Indigenous PAC staff and management to evolving legal and policy relationships between Native American tribes and the federal government and state governments, with this COVID-19 emergency as an example. From this, you'll be able to see how policy and laws evolve. What's left out here is what you've asked for me in 12 slides, Kurt, is a class on political science, constitutional law, federal administrative law, and federal Indian policy, all at once. And you can get sucked into that, as most of us practitioners are one way or the other. And those areas are so large that they have their own professional cadres. You'll have federal Indian lawyers as well as consultants that specialize in health, that specialize in land, that specialize in roads, that specialize in gaming. It's like asking, do you specialize in the federal government? And you'll see that what I do believe is going to come out of this briefing as a vision for the future that many are writing about now. And that is that increasingly, tribes are no longer organizations or communities and political groups that are dictated to, but rather they are being introduced into a large federal system and slowly being integrated. We're kind of in the middle right now, however, in the kitchen when all the ingredients are being thrown in for whatever's going to be baked. And it looks real messy right now. And the COVID-19 emergency proclamation and the legislation that comes out of it is a perfect example of how tribes are getting just caught in crossfires. Lots of opportunities, but crossfires. This quote comes from a Harvard Law Review not law review. It's actually, they have a symposium. I wrote an article in this thing one time, but this was written just about 3 years ago. And that is the changing landscape of federal Indian policy and what they see as a future. And the conclusion, one of the sentences in there that came up with a decent conclusion for our slide was just this: as a result of significant federal political commitment to tribal self-governance, complemented by successful economic development for some tribes, tribal governments have seen a major resurgence in authority and legitimacy. While the sovereign status quo ante prior to the arrival of Columbus in the Western Hemisphere may be impossible for tribes to achieve, meaning independent nations, tribal governments are now more fully woven into the tapestry of federal, state, and local government institutions that cover the United States. Hopefully, when we're finished with just the next few slides, you'll appreciate a little bit more the world that the Muckleshoot tribe and Joe and its council and its various interests in the council and tribe participate in. And you'll see that it's a complicated world if they want to make it that way. This is a page that summarizes basically what's happened in this last month. You had two things happening. One was an executive action, which we call an executive order, a proclamation, where the president basically put the Secretary of Health and Human Services in charge to be able to waive and make changes in existing regulations and existing law in the Medicare, Medicaid, and other public insurance programs, including children's and state different programs. That when they do this, they would have to give notice to the Congress and certify certain actions every time and before he took them. And these would be subject to applicable laws and appropriations, because the president doesn't print the money and neither does the Secretary of Health and Human Services. They have to rely on Congress to do that. Finally, and this is kind of it's sort of a footnote really, but I'll come back to this at the end when we talk about where tribes are. But the order also, the proclamation made it very clear that as much as they were providing authority to provide opportunities to rights and benefits, that the proclamation itself didn't vest legally any right, benefit, or cause of action in anybody that they could come back and sue the government over. So basically they said, hey, we're offering to do all this, but there's no standard of care here, there's no obligation, and you can't pull us into court and tell us we didn't do it right. So as much as all the criticism there is of the president, it's all politically based, it's not legal. Anybody who sues is going to have to find something other than the proclamation to find a right that they can assert in a federal court, and that's what that was all about. The CARES Act, which thank you, Ashley, for giving me those that work that you did. The CARES Act just came out on March 27th, so we're talking about real new stuff. You can be assured that there's at least 100 law firms all over the country working for various Native organizations, states, and different representative groups that are putting together nice $50,000 memos outlining what's going on in the CARES Act. This didn't cost you that much. Between what I looked at and a lot of what Ashley did, I went through there, and I can't say that all of this is absolutely accurate because it comes from 12 different directions, and I don't have a law firm to back it up. But basically, you have a number of pots of money that came into place. There was about $2 trillion, I think, total that was allocated in this thing. A certain amount of that went to tribes, and this was the third round. The first ones had to do with unemployment insurance and some health care initiatives. This one had to do with a broad range of issues that were of interest to tribes. As a footnote, I'm sure that tribes had some of their lobbyists and lawyers working on this, and there might have been key tribal officials, but what I understand is the case. Most of these came out of the House, and most of these came out of NCI and its lobbying for a lot of what went into this. Probably also members of the National Indian Health Board and their lawyers and representatives. This isn't a complete list, but this at least lays out where a lot of the money is. Department of Treasury has $8 billion that goes to tribal governments. There's no direct Indian agency in the Department of Treasury. This is supposed to aid government, state, and local, and tribes. This is the tribal portion that are adversely impacted by the epidemic. There are no regulations for the distribution of this money. There's no tribal organization that has a representative body in the Department of Treasury. This is Munchkin or whatever his name is. And so NCAI and the tribes are going to be paying very close attention to the way in which this money is distributed. I'm fairly certain that the recommendation is to put it over into the bucket of money that is well regulated in the BIA and IHS self-governance bundles, which already have allocation systems out to the tribe based on historical factors of population, size, and various interests. Department of Interior, BIA, has $453 million to address social welfare and other tribal governance issues. The biggest one, Health and Human Services, and there's about 6 different organizations within Health and Human Services. The biggest IHS of 1.032 billion. That has to do with obviously the biggest impact of this proclamation and this emergency order is on the health and welfare of people in the states, local governments, and tribes. And each one of these organizations has their own interest in that. SAMHSA for the behavioral health, CDC for the testing, CMS, I think, has a lot of statistical things they want to keep track of, as well as Medicaid, Medicare. HRSA is truly the keeping track of statistics and some technology, and IHS is just the facilities, doctors, and healthcare. HUD got into the game. They've got money, that special appropriations that were added on the top to address housing and safety of people. Department of Agriculture, 100 million, Department of Education, 69 million, and the Department of Transportation, 30 million. Now, how does all of that, is there some pipeline to the tribes from each one of these agencies? Some of them have a longer history with the tribes, and some are very new histories and actually evolving histories. For example, Department of Transportation really is the agency that handles federal highway monies. And yeah, federal highways do cross tribal lands, but tribes have their own way of dealing with their internal transportation systems. In the past, it had been the Department of Interior, BIA, and there's the Interior Roads IRR program, where they have their own monies there that manage Indian highways and Indian roads on reservations. And tribes would petition and do petition for their allocation of these monies nationwide. And basically, if you have more roads and more people, you get more money. But that isn't always the case. Most of these funds, including even IHS funds allocations, are based on initial allocations way back when whatever law originally allocated this money, and has evolved over time so that with BIA and Indian Health Service, the tribes themselves manage these monies through contracts or compacts since 1978 and periods after that, 1994 with the Indian Health Amendments. So it has shifted from a federally bureaucracy managed pot of money to a tribally managed pot of money with federal oversight with the Department of Interior and Health and Human Services. Department of Transportation history with tribes is relatively new. Tribes bid, local tribal construction organizations bid on those road projects, and they'll do a certain amount of them. But here recently, since 2004, I believe, now 2016 is when they got started, Department of Transportation has initiated, along with Department of Interior, a compact process called the Tribal Transportation Self-Governance Program, where tribes now are even cutting BIA out of the middle. Because really these road monies, the planning for BIA roads went through Department of Transportation. Now tribes have the option of either going along with the old system, having the BIA get the money for them, and then they get the money from BIA and then they make their planning and go through that whole rigmarole. But many tribes now, since 2016, have the option of compacting directly with the Department of Transportation and dealing as a state or national tribal government in managing its own roads with oversight by the Department of Transportation. A lot of tribes are going that way. The last tribe I helped run, Kenaitze, we did that. We opted to do the compact with the Department of Transportation, and now their monies are overseen by DOT instead of BIA, because outside of maybe one guy or one lady who oversees the grants in the BIA program, their engineering and road support departments have diminished. Department of Transportation has more assistance and more help and more expertise. So that's a modern example of how this relationship is evolving. But let's go back and see where it starts and work back to this slide. Are there any questions so far? Is everybody awake?
None from me, but this is great context.
No, it's
Well,
great context.
Don't forget the swirly ride. You'll understand more as we go on here. What I warned when I accepted this assignment was that I would try not to get sucked into the history of federal Indian policy. Sadly, we're going to have to go there sort of on a couple of slides so that you can understand where we are and where we're going. Actually, there's a few slides before this, because Indians came into contact with European people before the Articles of Federation or the Constitution. But this is the first time there's an official relationship between Native tribes and the United States. Just very briefly, before that, when the Spanish first showed up, they assigned their priests as kind of their Indian agents. At least that's how it evolved. And one of them, Bartolomeo de las Casas, who went over some of the first expeditions, eventually went back to Spain. He saw how the conquistadors were treating the natives, and they set up these things called encomiendas, which were kind of like forced kibbutzes. They were basically slave farms, and they made Indians and slaves. Bartolomé de las Casas didn't like what was going on. He thought it was abusive, and he went back to Spain and talked to the powers that be. He was opposed by some of the representatives of the rich folks, a guy named Sepulveda, who said, hey, not to worry here. Back in 1452, the Pope in a papal bull told us when we go out and discover places not to worry, that these people are, these dark people are not Christians, they're not Catholics, and you have rights over their lands and they don't really matter. Sepulveda took it one step further. He basically said that these people that they ran into were beasts of burdens. They didn't have souls, and so you didn't have to worry about them any more than you'd have to worry about cattle. Bartolomeo de las Casas opposed that. He said that they're people, that they have souls, and that if they don't specifically have rights, they should be watched out for. Now, you could be cynical I think that Bartolomeo de las Casas did have this human right line in him, and he truly did through that period of time. The king eventually had him be kind of like the BIA secretary over the New World while he was still alive. But he didn't always make the right step. His alternative to treating the natives bad was he suggested to the king that they should start buying slaves in Africa. So he just passed the buck. The debate occurred. Bartolomeo de las Casas prevailed. The cynical view is that priests in the church had to have something to do in the New World, and they wouldn't have much to do if they were just a bunch of pigs and cattle to preach to. But if there were people with souls capable of being saved, then, hey, maybe they could carry on. It was also consistent with the papal bull that basically said, when you show up somewhere, what you do, you have to give them two chances while you're meeting them to convert and become Catholics. And if they do that, then you can be peaceful. If they don't, then you can whoop on them and have wars and battles. And that was basically the policy of the Spanish. That said, the Spanish did do things that that the United States didn't do. They certainly settled the lands, and a little bit like Alaska and the Russians, they were more interested in the economics of the settlement than the settlement itself. And as a consequence, when they were leaving the Mexican territories that the United States acquired, they had already transferred actual title and land grants to the pueblos. Not trust lands, but true crown properties, just like as if they were a colony. And so there are slight differences there. When the United States comes into being in 1776 and the Constitution is written in 1786, you had some states that were, in a revolution. They were small, they were not that powerful, they were having to find allies in the French and the non-loyal Canadians and whoever else would help. And they did look to assistance from the tribes early on. And their preferred way of dealing with tribes and their ability to settle lands was to enter into agreements with them, pay them monies, promise them goods, services, protection. And so before the Constitution and before the Articles of Confederation, the British were the first ones that initiated that kind of treaty or agreement process. The Articles of Confederation was a hop, skip, and jump to a constitution. If you've studied your political science, it wasn't very effective. It still had really states as the primary sovereign. The federal government did things, but only with permission of the states. And it did establish, however, in that agreement that the Continental Congress would have authority over external treaties and relations with Indian tribes, who were still viewed as independent at that time. Once the Constitution is enacted, however, in 1786, the federal government asserts exclusive authority over Indians and Indian lands without interference from the states. In fact, although it's young at that time, there's a number of United States Supreme Court cases that flesh out that Commerce Clause. It's actually part of the Constitution, and there's a slide later on here that gives you the language, but basically it says the federal government shall have exclusive authority over Indian tribes. In 1834, they actually passed a law called the Tribal Non-Intercourse Act, and the BIA was actually formed in 1824. And they sent out Indian agents to deal with Indians, to enter into peace treaties, to enter into agreements of good faith. They provided a lot of education, sometimes medical assistance later on. And even at that time, there was some of that technology transfer, if you want to call it in today's terms. But the main thing that they were doing was regulating the interaction between U.S. citizens and citizens of states and the tribes, because there was constant poaching of land going on. The Indian agents would enter into a treaty ratified by Congress, and then they'd have to change it the next year or two because something was discovered on the land or too many settlers were moving in, and they'd have to change the agreement. It sounds a heck of a lot like the situation right now in Gaza with the Palestinians and the Israelis. They enter an agreement 1 year, and a few years later, the settlers move in, so they try to amend the agreement again until here at the very end, Kushner seems to propose a Palestinian Termination Act, which says that, never mind Palestine, Israel knows what you need and you don't have to worry about it. There's a similar trend in U.S. federal Indian policy. The treaty period ended in 1871. There were a large number of Indian wars starting in the East in the 1780s, 1790s, overlapped with 1812, like the the French wars, the wars with Canada that followed the Revolutionary War. But as the settlers moved west, there were periods of Indian wars. In the East Coast, it was in the 1790s. The last ones out west, the big ones that included the Muckleshoot, were in 1855, 1856. What happened in most of those situations is the Indians would cause lots of trouble. A lot of people would die. Sometimes it was fairly organized. In the battles in the Muckleshoot area, the Muckleshoot actually had a number of bands that were associated with them, the Dumash down near the coast, and then ones all the way up into the Cascades. The battles occurred way up in the Cascades where settlers were coming into lands and miners were coming in there. And the tribes at the time warned the settlers, who they were acquainted with, but the miners and stuff were new entrants. They said, hey, there's going to be some problems. Stay at home. We're not going to bother you. And yet still people got killed. And later on, a big problem with that situation, the tribal chief got accused of all of those things, even though he wasn't around. It wasn't from the Muckleshoot. It was from tribe up further near Seattle. Because in the agreements that were proposed before that battle, they'd taken all kinds of lands away from them because that's where the settlers were, and he didn't like it, and they got into a battle. The Muckleshoot actually were the beneficiaries of two different treaties during that period of time, and the latter one is the one that actually created the reservation as it stands right now. It was supposed to be expanded, but those amendments were lost when the Civil War started. Anyway, by 1871, most of those battles are resolved. The settlement has reached from coast to coast. There's no longer any need to try to negotiate from tribe to tribe in these treaties. Plus, Congress is now representing, either through territories or states, people in these local areas, and they're tired of the president and his Secretary of War of Interior negotiating things, and then they get all the bitching coming back to them from the local citizens. So in 1871, they terminated the president's right to enter into treaties with Indian tribes. They were, by this time, the courts had called the tribes domestic dependent nations rather than foreign nations. So by definition, that should be excluded from the president's treaty power, which is supposed to apply to external relations with independent countries. And from 1871 to this day, federal Indian policy laws and all of the regulations that follow them are enacted by congressional act through the House and the Senate. You now have the Indian Affairs Committee is an important committee in the Senate and the House, and they have their own staff, and they have been there for a long, long time. BIA also was still around. They still drove the legislation by that time. And from 1871 all the way to the present, authority over Indian tribes is still initiated by the executive branch and the organizations and federal bureaucracies that deal with them, BIA, later on Indian Health, the Army. Up in Alaska, there was a Coast Guard that dealt with us quite a lot. And you have these reservations that have been created. And the good portion of the activity from around 1871 up until 1884 was keeping tribes on the reservation. They were having battles with the Chickasaw, with the Apache down south, trying to get Geronimo back onto the reservation. All those stories at this period of time when they're trying to round up Indians and keeping them on reservations. And then all the actions and all of the policies that were enacted by the federal government came from the BIA, came from the Army, came from the executive branch, or interests in Congress, cattle ranchers, railroads, and other interests that were pushing into land and stuff that they needed that natives had. At that time in 1871, there was 138 million acres of land held in reservations in the lower 48. By 1884, if you put another historical band down here, I'm sure what you'll find is the railroad. You'll see settlements. You see states being created right and left. And the Indians frequently, their communities were normally located where it was good to live. So they were valuable lands. As settlers moved in, there was more and more pressure to move the natives out of agricultural lands, out of valuable lands. And there's no accident that when you look at the modern map reservations, that the natives are way the hell up a valley or up on top of a mountain or pushed out into a desert, because they got pushed off of their traditional lands by and large. Muckleshoot was a little bit more lucky in that respect. And then in the Northwest, their treaties came later. They established themselves in areas, and they were put down where they lived. Down in Oregon, they weren't so lucky. A lot of the tribes there, they had battles also, 1855, 1856, and they were rounded up and put on 2 or 3 different Grand Ronde and Silettes, where there are aggregations of 5 or 6 different tribal and linguistic groups on one reservation. I read a book by one of the old survivors. He was a kid when this happened, and he remembered I think it was 1905 or something like that, when they were rounded up, put on a boat, headed out to the Pacific, back up a river and onto a reservation where none of them ever came from. It was a Siletz reservation. And he was Athabascan, because there are some Athabascan groups in Southern Oregon and Northern California. There's even an Athabascan group in Washington that had come down the mountain range about 800 years ago and popped out into these areas and coexisted. So there was some relocation and removal, but in Washington state, there was less of that. Sometimes the tribes moved themselves and then ended up getting a reservation wherever they moved. We know about the Trail of Tears, where the tribes from the southeast were moved out to Oklahoma, to Indian country, but there was one tribe there that had already moved on their own ahead of time. The old settlers, part of the Oklahoma Indians. And likewise, that group that you were dealing with in Montana, they were originally over near the Great Lakes, and they moved over into Montana, mainly because of the sort of domino effect of settlers and people moving into New York and Michigan and that area, pushing Huron and Iroquois and others, who then moved west, and lots of tribes, a little bit more passive ones, or ones that didn't want to be in battles all the time, moved on their own and moved across inland. And so that not voluntary, but involuntary self-migration occurred in a number of different tribes. So you have to read the history of every tribe to find out if they're actually located in the place they were, or if they have a history of forced or forced voluntary migration. In 1883, they passed the Dawes Act, which was an official policy by the federal government. The rationale was that, hey, these tribes have all kinds of lands. They really don't need them. This is then during the Reconstruction era after the Civil War. And, they were giving blacks 160 acres and non-natives had 160 acres. Why wouldn't 160 acres be enough for a native family? Plus, we can teach them to be farmers and ranchers and learn, and they'll become nice folks with a picket fence and a pitchfork. So the Indian Reorganization Act took large native reservations and allotted them to individuals. And oh, by the way, the remainder of it, would it be put into a trust fund or something for the natives? Oh, heck no, they don't need that. 160 acres is all they need. So the rest was sold to settlers, to railroads, and the like. In that period of time between 1871 and 1934, native lands were reduced to 48 million acres. They basically lost 90 million acres, more than 2/3 of all the lands that they had in 1871. As you can see, one of the common threads here throughout federal Indian policy early on was a settlement of the frontier, acquisition of tribal lands, and attempting to have peaceful relations, or at least manageable relations, with Native people. And that was the focus of federal Indian policy, and it was all dictated from above. First the president and the executive, later the Congress and organizations. In 1934, during the Roosevelt administration, they were rebuilding the country in the Depression, and one of the things they saw was tribes were not really doing very well in this period of allotment. That they were broken down, the tribal organizations themselves were being lost, and there was just too much effort being put into managing their lands and manage their people. They needed to, Roosevelt administration said, hey, maybe they should be doing this on their own. So they passed the Indian Reorganization Act that allowed tribes to restructure themselves as elected councils, that stopped allotment, and also had a provision, Section 17, which we know about with Muckleshoot, where a tribe would be able to incorporate a federal business and try to see if they couldn't participate in the national economy. That's historical federal Indian policy in a nutshell. Any questions? Is everybody doing their crossword puzzles?
I loved it, Bart. It was awesome. Thank you.
Who's that?
Paul, new learner here, so thank you very much.
Oh, okay, Paul. Yeah, okay. Very good. Well, there is no test, so don't worry. This is kind of a summary of what happened in that period of time. Federal Indian policy changing tides. One of the things you'll also see, you haven't seen it quite yet, but there's a bunch of switchbacks. There'll be attempts to promote the tribes, put them on reservations, protect them, and then the Dawes Act to beat them up and take their lands, and then the Indian Reorganization Act, protect them, restructure them. And then after that, after World War II, suddenly it's promoted basically by some Utah congressmen and senators that said, hey, you know, treatment of tribes through the BIA and all these acts and stuff is discriminatory. They should be treated just like everybody else. And you have to understand, Utah was, and the Mormons in Utah were real good at trying to assimilate Native people. They did it to Hawaiians, they did it to Indians in Utah and northern New Mexico. And so their whole idea was, you know, they shouldn't have this special treatment. This is unfair to them. So they initiated this process called termination, starting in 1940 with a test case in Kansas. And with this high thought, this highfalutin thought that independence created strength, their way of dealing with that would be to terminate the tribes, not just allot lands to the individuals, but allot all of the remaining lands to whatever individuals were there, eliminate federal funding, because obviously that was a detriment to their progress, eliminate any services that the federal government provided to them, and have no responsibility for them, and don't protect them against the guys who've been having Indian wars with them for the last 100 years in the states, and make them subject to state laws. So in 1953, Public Law 280 made certain states mandatory jurisdiction over tribes in California, Wisconsin, Alaska, Oklahoma, and Oregon. In places where there had been Indian battles for hundreds of years, where in California they had actually bounties on Indians. You could be paid for killing them. And these guys were the ones who were now supposed to make things all good for us. This ended the trust for 12,000 natives and 2.5 million acres. It ended financial support for 100 reservations, and it transferred jurisdiction to the states. That was finally stopped in 1968 by Johnson during the 1960s Civil Rights Acts and various types of statutes that look towards community development, and that whole period of time where there was special legislation promoting community health and development. And tribes were one of the beneficiaries of that. Although Kennedy presided over two of the last termination acts of the Ponca in Nebraska. It took the Ponca, Nebraska, were terminated in 1968 until 1990 to finally get re-recognized and get settlements and getting some of their lands back. Most all of those tribes that had been terminated came back again, but it took lawsuits, it took all kinds of effort. They had their organizations beat up and unrecognized and no benefits for 20 and 30 years. Kurt, in Wisconsin and Menominee were one of the big ones. And Ada Deer is a national leader, and that was a young person back then who really made her strides as a leader in opposing termination and getting the Menominee recertified as a federal Indian tribe. So it's bounced back and forth. There's this yo-yo effect on federal Indian policy from the first time when the federal government asserts authority over it to these various periods of time, the Indian Reorganization Act and determination. Now, as of 1975, the Indian Education and Self-Determination Act provides for contracting of federal services by the tribes. So not only will the tribes reconstitute, but they'll start taking on the duties of the Fed under a contract or later on a compact. To the most recent sort of big policy is tribal consultation in 1994, where presidential proclamation, somebody's gonna have to tell me, I think it was, maybe it was Clinton, I'm not quite sure who the president was in 1994, where any agency doing anything regarding tribal matter would have to consult with them first and take public comment. And that is to the extent that the tribes weren't already initiating the action. So that's kind of the summary of those changing tides. This most recent time period is what really impacts us in this CARES Act and proclamation. You had tribes restored, but that's not altogether complete right now. You've been reading maybe some of the things about Mashpee and Martha's Vineyard. There's a buddy of mine out there, Hardin, who's runs a company as one of the tribal officials, but they were trying to they had a reservation established. They had the Obama administration helping them start it, and then local developers in adjacent states who were buddies of Trump sued in court saying that they couldn't do this under the Indian Reorganization Act. And the federal court said, hey, in order to be able to take a benefit of the provisions of the Indian Reorganization Act, where you can reconstitute tribal lands in trust and reconstitute the tribe, you had to have been existing in 1934 and recognized. Well, Mashpee were only recognized in the 90s. They were the ones who met the pilgrims on the beach, but the federal government finally just recognized this group in the 90s. The federal court said, hey, you can't take advantage of the benefits of the Indian Reorganization Act because you weren't officially recognized in 1934. They now have special legislation coming through. I'm pretty sure, those acts will be acted upon just like the Ponca did in 1990. They will probably get their lands back in trust. It's only 200, 300 acres. They still own it, but it's not in trust, so they can't put a gaming facility on there. Not because it isn't good for them or even good for Boston or Massachusetts, but because it's bad for a non-native casino down in an adjacent state who's buddies with the current administration. So that's the bad side of federal Indian policy. 1975, you had the Self-Determination Act. It directly impacts BIA services, IHS services through contracting and compacting. But you also have a number of other acts that are passed that are in that vein. 1971, we didn't have reservations. We escaped the termination, but basically the brakes were put on in creating reservations in the state during that period of time in the 40s and 50s. And then we weren't a state the state finally was formed in 1958, 59. And even though in the Statehood Act there was a provision that said that tribal land use and occupation will be protected, the state immediately started selecting the most valuable lands and most settlable lands, which obviously were wherever the natives lived, just like the good old days. And the natives had to combine and sue in State versus Udall to get an injunction against the Secretary of Interior granting land conveyances to the state. And that all occurred in 1964, 65, 66. My tribe actually discovered, we had a reservation. I grew up on a reservation, Milwaukee, 30,000 acres. They found oil and gas on that. BIA issued leases. We got about 15 million, which in today's money is, I don't know, $500 million or something like that. And we actually funded the very first meetings of the BIA. The thing that's strange about Alaska is that we still have people who are on the Statehood Commission, that State Constitutional Convention. We still have natives who were in the creation of the Alaska Federation as that first went to oppose the state. And my mother and my uncle were some of the ones who wrote the checks to get AFN started. What happened is we finally got a land settlement. We didn't get a land settlement based on tribal status or reservations. In fact, it terminated Aboriginal title, and in exchange, lands were given over to state corporations because the state was an important negotiator in this process. The natives who were alive at the time, and I had coffee with Willie Hensley, who wrote the treatise on this thing when he was a young student at George Washington. He said, Bart, all we were interested in was getting the lands. We didn't know corporations from a hole in a wall. And so, the state, who did know what corporations were, wanted to assert authority over tribes and tribal nations by having them incorporate state corporations, which is what happened. 215 village corporations were formed, 13 regions, one of them out of state. 44 million acres was acquired. If you remember back when, that after the termination era, after the general allotment, there were only 48 million acres of reservations in the lower 48. We have 44 million acres of fee title lands in Alaska. It's not under a trust title, and it's held by native corporations that can buy and sell it as they please. But the stock in those corporations is restricted so that it can't be bought or sold. And some of them have actually created open enrollment like a tribe so that it's uniformly owned by everyone, but that's still a minority. And so the ownership and interest in the native lands in Alaska evolved by wills and interstate succession and current transfers to close relatives. So it's hit or miss. That has still to be resolved. We already talked about the Indian Education Assistance Act. Right now, the annual budget for the BIA is $1.9 billion. Over here, the Indian Self-Determination Act, contracting and compacting, which had become more important in IHS world. BIA has diminished in importance because a lot of everything short of trust obligations to review trust lands on reservations and native allotments, most BIA functions have been transferred out to tribes. IHS also, but it's got more money. It's got 3 times more money than the BIA, so it's become a real center of development for tribes. And more than half of all the tribal healthcare facilities in the country are managed under contract or compact. And the budget is $5.9 billion total. I think the core budget on the tribal side is easily $3 billion. 2 other areas, though, that created real economic development and strength in tribal country was the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, 1988. The Seminole, who were one of the ironically terminated tribes, by 1979 they were back again, and probably with the intercession of some Southern Cubans who were familiar with casino gambling in Cuba, and some of the mob, actually, initially, they formed a casino in Hollywood, Florida, which is just between Boca Raton and Miami. And they started the first casino. The Pachanga out in California and the Morongo formed one in California around the same time. And they got into a lawsuit, and the federal government confirmed that that the tribes had the right to form casinos, so long as they weren't prohibited under, well, and later on it was, so long as they weren't prohibited under state law generally. They eventually, and today, this is one of the most important development tools in Indian country in the lower 48. We've got 460 casinos, 240 tribes, in 29 states. And this last year, they did over 30 billion a year in revenue. And these are, for the most part, self-regulated with very little BIA or IHS oversight. They've created their own National Indian Gaming Commission of 3 commissioners. The chairman is appointed by the president, and the 2 others are appointed by the Secretary of Interior. But basically, they're recommended by the tribes. And their whole purpose is to just oversee a regulatory regime for the casinos. The other area that has been a real big benefit was 8A contracting. And in 1986, 8A, Small Business Association contracting had always been a provision of the Small Business Act back into the 50s, where small businesses were able to contract with the federal government to provide services. However, since World War II up until about the 80s, there are only 4 or 5 major global government contracting companies, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, and others, who controlled 80% of all government contracts, significant ones in defense contracting, which is a majority. There's civilian contracts and military. Military is the vast majority. But in 1986, these laws were amended to include as disadvantaged groups Indian tribes and Alaska Native corporations. And since that time, those have exploded. Some of the biggest actors in the lower 48 are in Alabama, the Chickasaw, the Cherokee, the Winnebago in Nebraska. And in Alaska, we have a number of them. The top 24 do about $14 billion worth of business in Alaska. You have to remember that out of 2.6 million natives in the United States, only 150,000 at most live in Alaska. So 24 organizations in Alaska generate $14 billion annually in revenue, and not a single casino. We don't have casinos. Whereas the other tribes in the lower 48, 30 billion in 460 casinos. So there's a lot. And this group, the Native American Contractors Association, represents tribes and native corporations here. The National Indian Gaming Association represents them here. The Indian Health Board and various other advisory boards are here. And in the BIA, historically, the oldest organization is the National Congress of American Indians, formed in the 20s. That is a national representative organization lobbying and watching out for the interests of tribes in Washington, D.C., when it was the old IHS, BIA, and different groups that were coming down basically legislating on tribal groups. NCAI, as we remind you, was probably the key group in proposing to the House all of those provisions that came out of the CARES Act. Okay, any questions about that slide? We've got maybe 10 more minutes. I'm sorry, Kurt.
No, continue. Thank you.
No questions? Maybe I should have had a test. Okay, some of you like pictures. This is a little description of where all this policy is going and what it can be described as. This first period up until Congress took over was paternalistic treaties. Basically, the federal government looking out over its own interests, acquiring lands and keeping the peace on the while its settlers took over lands. From 1871 to 1934, this initial period of congressional authority and legislation You've ended the Indian Wars, you created reservations, you're trying to assimilate. The whole policy then is to assimilate natives. You'll remember these pictures of a young little boy with all of his traditional garb on, and then the one next door is him in Haskell with his gray suit and shaved head. But ultimately, what there's really going on was more organized loss of land through the Dawes Act and allotment period. 1934 to 68 is where you really get this schizophrenic federal Indian policy. A lot of modern day commenters call federal Indian policy schizophrenic. It's this period of time where they earn that moniker. This is erratic discretion by whoever's in charge in the Congress and whatever's the flavor of the day. So that in 1934, it was to reconstruct the tribes, give them their lands back, try to help them create federal corporations. 1940s to 50s, the Mormons come in and say, nah, that's discriminatory. It's not good for them to be given all that stuff. So let's take all the benefits, take the lands, give them to them and let them sell them to us. And then, see if they can make it. One of the worst situations starting in early 60s, and some people here may know their uncles or relatives. One of the ideas also, and this has been a common one, I don't want to offend anybody, but the Catholic Social Services Organization and a lot of these social organizations thought it was in the best interest of Indians to get out of their communities, to leave their reservations, because just bad news there. So the Catholic Social Service agencies were one of the worst about grabbing Native babies and adopting them out to non-Native families. The Indian Child Welfare Act in the mid-60s and 70s was formed primarily because of that action by the Catholic Social Service Agency. But the federal government did it also. BIA had a relocation program where it didn't terminate your interest as a tribal person, but it basically showed up, talked to a bunch of young guys and people and said, hey, if I got a deal for you, here's a ticket to LA, and here's a place at YMCA where you can get a room, and here's $25, more than money than you've seen in a long time, and you can make a living in town. They've took whole families like that out of Wisconsin, moved them into Chicago, gave them $25, and then left. And there's stories, written stories from these young kids and those families. Said their poor dad was a carpenter and had a job back at home. He got there, he could get a job anywhere. His mama was working in a store and they didn't have enough food and they couldn't afford to pay the rent in this urban apartment. They eventually, 5 to 8 years later, wandered back, although the older sisters by that time had hooked up with somebody in Chicago or something. So broke up families. It was not successful. But I talked to a lot of older guys who were moved to LA and then finally wandered back home. It was a very, very strange policy. So by 1968, however, there was an acknowledgement during that period of time that these policies were not successful. They stopped the termination era. Very soon, within a few years, it culminates in the Indian Education and Self-Determination Act. And there were a number of other various types of community action programs that were going on at that time that were introduced into Native communities that created social action and social advocacy in tribal communities all over in Alaska also, where this is where activism really got started. The AIM movement and other things were the evolution of these things, promoting tribal identity, tribal status, tribal authority. And the Native American Rights Fund was formed during this period of time where they're starting to say, hey, enough of this. We are people, we have powers, we have the ability. And what evolved from that was Native American, the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, was the contracting and BIA and IHS services, was creation of casinos, and now tertiary businesses and tertiary interests. There's an article that I included in there that says, well, where now? Where do we go from now? And Kevin Gover, who was a schoolmate of mine in the Indian Law program in UNM, he eventually became the second director of the Indian Museum, American Indian Museum in DC, and now he's a dean of a law school in Iowa or Ohio somewhere. And this article and some of his quotes say that what's really going on now, we're in the middle of it. It looks like a bowl of goulash, but tribes are slowly getting fully integrated into a federal system of government. And that instead of just these individual lines of organized process between IHS, BIA, increasingly maybe EPA or HUD, there's a whole mess of other organizations involving themselves with tribes. And many of them want direct relationships like that one that I told you about, Department of Transportation compacting. But it's on an ad hoc basis, and you still have opposition from non-native casino owners, states in some cases. Other situations, those states are seeing this as a benefit. So that New Mexico and Washington, they have their actual Indian agency departments. They have their own BIAs that interact with tribal organizations. And they also do it in some of these national health, transportation, and services organizations. So that where some of these writers and some of these thought people are thinking is that tribes eventually will become part of this federal system as kind of like a city-state. It'll be different because tribes aren't set up like states are. They're more of a command economy model where, yes, there are individual economies and individually owned companies, but tribes are governments and tribes are businesses. The tribes are the ones who ultimately own the casinos. Tribes also, or tribal organizations, own these native contracting companies. They have intermediaries, and the most successful ones put distance between the politics people and the business folks. But that was a real struggle over the last 10 or 20 years. I've talked to the guy who runs the Ho-Chunk group in Nebraska, and he says, man, initially all the old guys on the council, all they ever wanted to do to my company every year was just to sweep all the cash. They didn't give a shit what I was doing, and I wouldn't have anything to invest in the following year. They finally put some controls in that process and distance between him and the tribe, and as a consequence, his organization is buying up all the land and all the buildings around the tribal reservation and developing things, and the tribe is getting more. So it's going to take a series of lessons for them to understand how that works. Any questions on that slide? So, COVID-19 National Emergency Care Acts. You've got initially that you've got laws and regulations impacting tribal governments and Indian people are largely driven by tribal governments and policy groups now, instead of the agencies themselves. So even though you've got that list of all those agencies with all that money, each one of them has an advisory group, or there's a national advisory group coming from the tribe. You'll see it in the next slide, that advise how to carry that out. And as you've seen from some of these conferences about the BIA monies, the $500 million, how are you going to distribute it? The $1 billion from IHS, how are you going to distribute it? The tribes refer back to their current relationships, which is funding agreements. They've already got historical allocations. BIA, they have already got historical allocations. What does the Department of Treasury do? They don't have an advisory group. They haven't had relations with the tribe. How do you determine who is, quote, needy for that $500 million that they've got? Those are relationships that will have to evolve, and they don't, as between the states and what they do, they'll have their own, little food fight over there about whether New York gets more than Maine, that gets more than California. But in the end, because of these organizations, because of this evolving sophistication during the 60s and 70s and lots of trial and error, tribal economic and political power is more on par with opposing forces, whether they're commercial, governmental, or the Fed itself. And yet we still fight old battles. The Mashpee got terminated because you got some Yahoo president and listening to private interests. And I'll have to wait for the next administration to fix it. And not all agencies are tied to these tribal consultation and contracting systems. Even though they're obliged to consult, they have very little history in doing it. And the Treasury, the FCC, Forest and Park Service have a little bit more, but they're also terribly entrenched bureaucracies of old white guys historically, even though they'll have their one native employee on the little public service ads. So this whole process, you're looking at integration of tribal style self-governance as a part of the federal system. It's piecemeal right now. What you're really talking about when you're going to be looking at the laws that got passed there, we already see that probably tribes had impact on the CARES Act through the House, through NCAI and their lobbyists, and maybe some of their particular Indian Health Board organizations, but it happened so quickly that it probably was primarily NCAI, who actually has a Congress office in DC, a new one, and they have policy people in each one of these areas, as well as, quite honestly, lobbyists from various large tribes that have a lot of money that can pay lawyers to go there on their own to help NCAI. That's how you got the provisions of the CARES Act. Trump, you know, he was forced to put his proclamation in quite late, but I don't know that we had much to do with that. These organizations that are there, you can see the transition between those that got started. There were some that were early that were tribal origins and tribal oriented, and others that came from the agencies where the agencies were reaching out, trying to get people on inside their organizations that would give them advice. And you can see these, both BIA and IHS have tribal self-governance advisory committees. There are a dozen people that are nominated by the tribes, and they occupy an office virtually in each one of those agencies and look at policy. HUD has a similar one, HUD Tribal Intergovernmental Advisory Committee. Most agencies, however, if they don't have a committee, will at least employ a tribal advocacy representative by region or sometimes nationally. For example, CMS has its own office. It's even part of IHS that already has a tribal advisory committee, but it has its own what is it called? Tribal advisory group comprised of 17 representatives, elected leaders from each one of the regions, as well as one from IHS, National Indian Health Board, NCAI, and one from their actual advisory group, internal advisory group. So, you know, on this side, you can, when you say, when we talk and complain about tribal leaders always going to meetings, there's no lack of meetings for them to go to. They can go to a meeting if they manage to get on a health board, their own health board, if you have a health board in your tribe. Sometimes if you're so small, just be your council. But each one of the regions, Portland has a Portland Area Health Board where all the tribes have a representative. Then there's a National Indian Health Board where you can go to there, and they have a board there as well. And then you can see here that nationally, the IHS internally has a health board. And then even one of their organizations, CMS, has their own representative board. And the derivative, the person who is a member of a tribe, who's a member here, is now a member of the organization within the organization. It is a cluster. And out of this comes legislation, recommendations for regulations, and policy, that informal way in which those things are implemented. Right here is a swirly ride. This is a swirly ride. All of this comes into the Fed's position on something. On the tribal side, you have tribal councils. They all have their own, sometimes they'll have their own housing board, their own Indian Health Board or advisory committee. They will also sometimes have regional organizations of tribes or interstate or intrastate organizations. In Alaska, we've got AFN, which is a statewide organization. Of the 300 or so tribes, we have 3,000 people attend those. The South and Eastern tribes east of the Mississippi have their own AFN called United South and Eastern Tribes. If Joni's on board, she knows that there's 6 or 7 Sioux tribes in the Midwest. I can't remember, but they do have their overarching organization that is representative of all the Sioux tribes and Sioux bands. I just can't remember what the name of it is. Region-wide and nationwide, you also have organizations that representative bodies come from the tribes, but a lot of them are either geographically oriented or issue oriented. I've already talked about the Indian Health Board, the National Indian Housing Council, the National Indian Gaming Association, the oldest one, NCAI, from the 20s. There's even international organizations of tribal people. Inupiaq Circumpolar Conference is a group of Inupiaq people from Alaska, Canada, and Greenland. And you have the biggest of them all, the most obscure, the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. This was enacted in 2007 with a positive vote of 144 countries, excluding, of course, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and the United States. Wouldn't know why that was. And you've got lots of people in our communities who, who say that this is a real influence on policy, global policy, and Indigenous people. And that is absolutely true. They have a wonderful forum. They have a nice, happy yuck, and then try to convince Russia, China, Cuba, or United States, much less Canada or Australia, to do anything about it. The conclusion here: tribes have responded positively to the expansion of power. Indeed, tribes have adapted for more and more, have agitated for more and more authority. Many tribes long ago developed capacities far beyond any perceived need for the federal control aspects of the trusteeship. Indeed, in business negotiations or litigation with the federal government, it is not unusual for a tribe to have professional representatives and employees who are equal, I would say superior, to the talent on the federal side of the table. This was a quote from this study, and also my buddy. So where are we going from here? Kevin Gover said, an Indian trust for the 21st century. In large measure, tribes and their members have been relieved of the intrusion of federal presence of the past with no withdrawal of federal support. Really what you're pushing for here is next is recognition and coordinated integration of tribes in the United States federal system of government. Some tribes have specifically asked for it based on old treaties. I believe it's the Cherokee that entered into a treaty during the removal period, or maybe even before that, that allowed them a representative in the federal government. Just kind of like the territories have a standing representative, and they've been exercising their authority to do that, sending a representative to Congress. What are we looking at when we're talking about tribal self-governments, empowering communities, optimizing revenue, providing public safety services, sustainable, profitable businesses, maintain critical assets, preserve natural resources and heritage? Everything that a country does, only in this case, maybe a little bit more like our Eastern relatives, Chinese and Eastern Asian, Singapore, and other countries that have free business, free markets, but much more governmental control over affairs. In most everything, we do come from the East. Our cultures are Eastern based, and there's a lot more affinity with how they do things in Singapore and Hong Kong than how they do things in New York in the Native community. So that's it. Thank you. Any questions? If you go back now, you can see with how things evolve, how in the world are we going to carry these things out? There's old legacy ways of doing it through tunneled legislation and regulation, and there's others where they're evolving. Department of Transportation through compacts. Who knows what's going to happen with the Department of Treasury? That's an old, one-to-one, all the tribes against the federal agency. So we'll see. We'll have to see how this is carried out. Kurt, that's it.
Bart, what's your best advice for tribes today to take action to be able to tap into these different CARES Act funds? I mean, I know that it's a swirly ride. What is the next best step for them to take today?
Well, I give them more credit than that. Now, Muckleshoot has, I think, 3,000 tribal members, something like that. They're actually one of the larger tribes in the Northwest. And if you look at the linguistic map and cultural map for the Northwest, pretty much everything north of Puyallup are all Suquamish language-based tribes until you get all the way up to Victoria and there, and then it changes a little bit. So they're all related. All of the tribes you're dealing with right now, Nisqually, Suquamish, all of them were bands of a larger tribal organization. On the IHS, they're going to be, they already have their health board that is in the Portland office. The only problem right now is there's nothing working, right? All of the IHS people are at home dealing out of, so there's nowhere to meet. There's nowhere to coordinate this. They're having to count on their Indian Health Board. They're having to count on NCAI. They're having to count on their higher representatives to watch out for the policy and create the channels. There's not much that they can do pushing from underneath. Even a tribe as big as Navajo is complaining about that. You know, the only advantage Navajo has is that there's 300,000 of them and 127 communities are all each one of them is as big as Muckleshoot. That's their power and that's their weakness also. They have, I think it's 12 IHS hospitals and facilities and 3 compact facilities. So they're having to count on NCAI. They have the advantage of having a lobbyist in DC, but I'm pretty sure she's locked in a room also, as well as their lawyers. So the real problem right now with this lockdown is this policy requires a lot of face-to-face, a lot of negotiation that's hard to do over the internet and the phone. I would, they probably have, besides Joe, they probably have a sharp, well, I'm hoping, from the sounds of it, their attorney didn't have much experience in this area, but somebody there is a decent planner. And if not within the Muckleshoot, somewhere in the region, there's somebody who really knows IHS funding agreements and policy. And there's somebody who knows tribal roads, and there's somebody who knows, and coming from the Northwest, somebody knows about internet and FCC stuff. I do believe that the tribes are going to really have to push NCAI and maybe on a regional basis get some planning groups together, specific and teams, specialty teams put together to actually address this money. And sadly, they're going to have time because you know it's not going to get out there anytime soon. BIA was just, I mean, with all of the routes and paths that BIA has, they were doing their consultation last week saying, well, geez, you know, what are we going to do with this 500 million? Nice to talk to you. We'll see you next week, same time. So it's not going to go really fast, I don't think. And you've got just in Health Human Services alone, there's 6 groups that control that $1 billion. Most of it's IHS, but then there comes in other buckets also. So I think they're really going to have to draw on those organizations that they have. And if those organizations don't have the competent staffing, then they're going to have to create some ad hoc staffing.
Now that's helpful. That was our impression of some of those calls from last week as well. And it's good to know that, I mean, that the tribes aren't necessarily missing any huge opportunity. It's still going to take a lot of work and coordination with those regional offices and with those national offices. So
the only warning is that because of these old legacy tunnels and all these other relationships, the money may go down a path and be gone. At least maybe not your portion, but a different way of proportioning it may have been already determined by the time you squeak or squawk. I think every tribe should be identifying what their personal and representative resources are, from attorneys to people on boards and committees, and then figure out the best group to put together, specialized just to look out over this. so that they at least have information as quickly as they can get it, particularly since nobody can get on a plane or a boat or a bus or whatever to get to wherever. The information, sadly, is even more important now than before. So, you know, Joe is probably handling a whole lot of stuff, but Joe should probably be identifying a small working group that has specialties in each one of these areas, if not in his own tribe, a friendly one nearby or an organization, so that they can keep up on all of this and be able to at least squeak and squawk before an option is taken among various legitimate options that might be harmful to them.
Yeah, that's very helpful, especially as you said. There's not a lot of vehicles with you know, some of those different agencies that you have listed out there. That kind of coordination on the ground and squeaking and squawking, if you will, is going to be really important, and to stay focused on saying what is the piece that we need.
In the IHS area, most everybody is saying funding agreement, but funding agreements based on old historical things. There may be that some tribes are more adversely, you know, affected than others, and they're going to try to squawk up. It already happens in Indian roads. This is one of the reasons why the Department of Transportation, and more than likely NCI and tribes, have been pushing for compacting for transportation, so they can cut the BIA out of it, so that because they complain that Navajo and others just grab the majority of everything, and then they're just left with some stuff to sweep the sidewalks. So, you know, if they go directly with Department of Transportation, some of them believe that, you know, they have a new base to bargain with. So there's a lot of old axes that are going to be involved with some of this.
Great. Well, thanks, Bart. I know we want to be respectful of people's time and let them get back to their lives. So appreciate you taking the time to outline all of this for us today. And we'll be putting this recording online, some snippets, putting on for live stream on our website. And appreciate everything you've done for us today, Bart.